And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. If you're a return listener and if you're a new listener, thanks for joining us. If you like what you hear, we'd be flattered if you would share it with your network and recommend us and review us. As vaccines and the COVID cloud, or the light at the end of that tunnel, seems to be somewhat nearer and perhaps imminent, I want to remind folks that we are still offering workshops and services online and doing that in personalized and innovative ways, as well as looking toward the future and hopefully soon in-person and on-site workshops similar to those that we were doing before COVID-19 hit us about a year or so ago. So if you are interested in our services, please visit wegrowteachers.com and navigate around project-based learning, differentiation, inquiry, growth mindset, lots of things that we can help with, but we'd love to help you if you are so inclined. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Michaeleen Doucleff, who, in addition to being a correspondent on the science desk for NPR, is an author of a new book called Hunt, Gather, and Parent. As you'll hear, I first heard Michaeleen on NPR as she was discussing her book, and I thought it would be an interesting conversation, and I was certainly not wrong. It was interesting as we sort of unpacked and talked about parenting and some of the parallels with classroom teaching management and some of those dynamics. One of the things that surfaced was sort of the idea of the hierarchy and power struggle and the idea of cooperative autonomy, which I may indeed steal for our work because I like the qualifier of cooperative on the term autonomy. And the book that she wrote uses her visits and experiences in a number of different cultures that are hunters and gatherer kinds of cultures, and how they interact and parent much differently than what we might think of as Western civilization parenting, and focuses on autonomy, connectedness, and competency. So we talked a lot about those things and mentioned things like free range and psychology and anger and emotions. So much to unpack there from a parenting perspective, but I do think and hope that it's useful as you think about teaching and managing autonomy in your classroom and the various pieces around that. Michaeleen, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation as a parent and as an educator and the overlap there. I first heard you, or at least I heard you that I was aware of hearing you, and in this context as you were talking on NPR, as you were talking about your new book, but you also do work as a correspondent or in another role in NPR. So give our listeners a little bit of background on who you are, so they know who they're listening to, so we can have this conversation more meaningfully.
Yes, so I'm a global health correspondent at NPR, and I cover mainly infectious diseases, disease outbreaks around the world before COVID even. I spent some time in Liberia during the Ebola outbreak, but then more recently I've been looking at cross-cultural parenting, and so parenting in different cultures and covering that angle too.
Right. And the new book, which is out now, right?
Yes.
Yes,
it's out.
Hunt, Gather, Parent. And as I was listening to the interview that you did on NPR, as we were talking before we started hit record, it struck me as interesting in the context of what we do and how we think about teaching and learning, which is constructivist and inquiry-based, but also my approach as a parent. And I, looking at the book, see lots of pieces that look familiar, or at least philosophically look familiar, but as we said, like, so parenting is really hard, and maybe that's a good disclaimer to get out in front, because you do mention that in the book. Like, this is not a parent shaming book, but there are some really interesting things to think about and some questions to ask here. So I guess maybe give us a little background on just like sort of the elevator pitch, and then we can dive into some of the pieces that I thought were interesting.
Yeah, parenting is super hard. And when we first became a parent, we felt a little bit like we had no clue what we were doing, my husband and I. And then we ended up with this daughter, Rosie, who is, she's very smart. She's incredibly intelligent, but she's also like super fiery and hot tempered and, just strong willed. And we went through this period when she was like 2 or 3 where we really couldn't handle her. And she would have these tantrums, and I would read all this advice in books, and things just wouldn't really help. Sometimes it would just make things worse. And I felt a lot like I was just kind of, we were kind of in deadlock, like a power struggle, and there was a lot of tension and conflict between us. And so during my job at NPR, they actually sent me down to the Yucatan, to a small Maya village, to do a story about parenting, and actually on paying attention. There's a couple of studies, interestingly, that look at how Maya children are better at paying attention than a lot of American kids in certain situations. So that was actually what I was interested in when I went down there. I'm like, what's going on there? But when I went down there, I was just, the moms I met just really blew me away. One of the moms, Maria in particular, like, they just had this calm confidence way of parenting. There was no yelling, no bickering, very little nagging. Like, there was just very little resistance. And yet the children were incredibly like kind and generous and helpful. Like, one morning I was talking to Maria, and her oldest daughter, age 12, Angela, was on spring break, and they had stayed up late watching a movie. And she got up around, I think it was like 11, walked past me and her mother and just started washing the dishes. Like, that was just the first thing she did on her spring break after sleeping in. And I was just like, what? Like, does she do that often? And, Maria was like, no, she, not every day, but, she does it. One time I went to the doctor's with her sister, and she cleaned the whole house. And so I was just like, what is going on here? Like, first of all, I want my child to be like that, and like, right. But so at first I kind of just chalked it up as to like something unique with the Maya, but then I started traveling other places and studying this, and I realized that actually the Maya are not the exception. In many parts of the world, use a very similar style of parenting, and also kind of have similar results with, like, you have this very calm, confident style, and then you kind of are raising these very kind, generous, helpful children. And so Hunt Gather Parent is really about that, like what the parents are doing and what we can learn from them and implement here in the U.S.
Right, and one of the things that I noticed, at least it seemed like a bit of a thread here, is that some of the civilizations or cultures in which you're referencing, there's a bit of a juxtaposition in terms of sort of like ancient and long-standing tradition versus what we have, which is, I think you framed it as sort of Western culture kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
The difference is, like, again, it's sort of like, living in the United States and feeling like we have this long history. When you talk to somebody in Europe or China and they say, wait, what? Like, really? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Right. I was a teacher
right,
go ahead.
No, I mean, right, like, these cultures are not ancient by any means, right? They are thoroughly modern. Like, one of the little girls I talked to wants to be a forensics, like a CSI person, because she might, they have Facebook. I mean, they're very, very modern, but they have, what I say in the book, they have parenting traditions that are deeply rooted in tradition, right? And that probably have been around for centuries, even thousands of years. Because a lot of these parenting techniques you find on every continent, and with with hunter-gatherers, so very ancient cultures, very people that have been there for thousands of years. And the fact that they're all kind of using similar techniques really implies that they're quite old. So yeah, a lot of our parenting and teaching methods are like 100 years old, right? 150 years old. And these methods that I talk about in Hunter-Gatherer Parent are likely thousands of years old, if longer.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. So I see some sort of parallels and I guess maybe some analogies in sense of teaching in classroom teaching, which is of course our focus to help teachers, what we call better prepare students for the modern world. And there is a real sort of argument or debate or tension between sort of teaching styles and the way that one might approach teaching. One, I mean, there's certainly more than two, but so one side is sort of more authoritarian, teacher control, teacher centered, and I know you use the word control, at least in the early parts of the book, more like this sort of battle for control. One of the things I actually wondered about when we first started the pandemic stuff going online was how many teachers, I just wondered this, and I actually got some interesting pushback on it because it's certainly not watertight, but there are no doubt teachers and educators who sort of use that control model, that authoritarian, like I'm even going to come put my, body very close to you. I'm going to talk sternly. I'm going to make you do what it is I'm telling you to do, versus a more constructivist. You talk about the sort of spectrum like free range children, and there is a sort of free range. I actually joke about, we do a lot of work in project based learning, and so we think a lot about. Matter of fact, one of the pieces of our PBL model is autonomy, and so that's a really important piece. And so pulling on that, what we don't want, at least in our model, in our view of that in the classroom, is what I joke about as free range chicken, like just just do what you want, right?
Right.
And that's not what we're talking about. But
no.
I guess maybe control might be a word to unpack, and how you do that in the book.
Yeah, so it's interesting because in the book I talk about how that's how we think of parenting. It sounds like that's how we think of teaching too, is this idea of all about control. So free range is like no control, and the child just kind of does whatever, like you say. And then this helicopter parenting, or what you're calling like authoritative, is like maximal control, right? Like there's like this spectrum. But what I talk about in the book is this kind of other dimension, I think, of learning and teaching children, where it's a collaborative approach. So it's a way of collaborating with the child. And it took me a really long time to understand what that means. But I think understanding it from autonomy is actually a really good way to do it, because what I talk about in the book is that autonomy is not the same to a lot of anthropologists and psychologists. Autonomy is not the same as independent. So, and some of the anthropologists and psychologists that I talk to actually talk about this idea of cooperative autonomy. So in many, many hunter-gatherer cultures, and likely throughout human evolution and history, autonomy was greatly valued. And so autonomy in the sense that everybody's allowed to make decisions for themselves, right? Valuing self-governance. But, and even little kids, so you could see it, like when we traveled to the Hadzabe, you could see even the little toddlers had a lot of autonomy. But this doesn't mean you do whatever, because there is this teaching very early on to the children to be responsible to others. So you're always giving back to the group. You're always looking out for ways of helping and cooperating, sharing, right? And so it's this idea of like you're making your own decisions in this kind of context of working together as the group, and always working towards a group goal, as well as respecting and taking care of the group. And so some people call this cooperative autonomy, that you're like free to make your own decisions, and you're kind of, you feel like from moment to moment, you're deciding what you do and how you do it, but you can't step on other people. You can't disrespect people. You have to work together for common goals, like collecting baobab pods or taking care of little siblings, right? And so I think it's really beautiful because it kind of mixes in to elements of both styles, right? It's not just you're doing whatever, and it's not that you've got this this powerful control over you, but it's like a mix. Because autonomy, if you look, right, so a lot of the book is about tapping into children's internal motivation, right? So their motivation, they're wanting to do something, right? That there's all this evidence that like when children want to learn, right, learning,
Sure.
Is great, much easier, things happen much better. And autonomy is when there's three elements that like psychologists have talked about, what taps into that internal motivation. And what's incredible is that you see these three elements in these cultures, in these communities that I talk about in the book. Like the parents use these three elements in spades, and they don't, they haven't read a psychology book, right? Like they've just like figured out and know that this works. This is what drives children to help, to take care, to do the things the parents want them to do, right? And so autonomy is one of those three things. And I think it's probably one of the most important, that if you don't have any, it's tough. It's tough to get kids to do something on their own and do it, from their internal state, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're trying to force them. I mean, so in some ways, there's several threads that I find interesting here. One of them, and we talk about teaching is sort of push teaching versus pull teaching, and some of that is related here. Like, I'm going to push all this information out at you, and you're going to do what I say. You're going to listen to me. You're going to pay attention. You're going to read whatever. At the sort of most traditional, most basic form, it's like memorize this and then test it and spit it out. And there's a variety of ways that might look in the spectrum, right? So that's maybe the extreme, versus what we call pull teaching, which is how do I help them make meaning of this, and how do I pull that thinking from them and give them the opportunity and build that skill of asking the questions that are important here, which is really in that context about content and deeper learning in pieces. But I think about one of the things that you mentioned in the book is sort of the sense of community, and I think that connects here, right? So
huge.
With my daughters, I have two daughters, 12 and 13, and I always found it odd that people put whatever they call baby door locks or whatever on their cabinets. And I find that odd because to me it's incumbent upon me as a parent to help my children understand in there are things that will hurt you, and so let's really think about this, right?
Right, exactly.
And of course that means you have to watch them in case they go there, right?
Right, but then that's a teaching moment, right? Like exactly. Like we tend to think that the way we teach safety issues is and life skills, right? This is a life skill, right? At the beginning, it's a life skill, is to kind of just avoid it, right? And whereas I would argue that humans for hundreds of thousands of years, it's the other thing. The parent is there and the child goes near it, and that's a moment that the parent teaches the child about it, right? Because otherwise you're not preparing the child to grow, right? You're just kind of blocking off the growth, right?
Right. You don't give them an opportunity to sort of fail, and there is the learning curve, and of course there's a bit of a friction point in a classroom versus what we find in sort of everyday living trying to raise a child, because while there are certain things you want to your child to learn, it's not like you have a pacing guide and a curriculum book and a standards and you don't have to have them ready for this by this date for a test, right?
Right.
So what
That's
we
huge.
think of, we talk about this sort of project-based learning, and the best forms of it are pretty organic, but most school is highly inorganic. It's pretty rigid and structured. So for teachers, that can be really, it can be more difficult to do this kind of approach in those settings for those reasons. But on the other side, so there is sort of a free school movement where kids develop all, they just do what they want. And I say that in the most charitable way, like they're sort of, it's designed to help them learn what they want when they want. And that, of course, means that they're driving all of that, which could potentially be nothing, right? I suppose, if it's done poorly. So there's that friction.
But see, maybe there's something in between. Like, I feel like what I've learned during this writing this book and researching it, which I spent like 4 years on, is that we often tend to go to these extremes, right? I mean, with parenting too, teaching too, right? So this reminds me of when the first time I went to this my village, I actually got to observe a hieroglyphic class. So a class of teaching kids hieroglyphs, my hieroglyphs. And first of all the kids went there voluntarily. No parent dropped them off. All the kids walked there and sat down. There was no forcing of going there. And again, this was on their spring break. So it was so then we get there and they all kind of sat down, it was outside and they all sat at chairs. And then the teacher came around and handed out, a sheet with the hieroglyphs on it, and then what they meant in Maya, like, or in Spanish. I forget what it was, but kind of like a code, like, right, like if you're going to write your name or whatever. And then he basically said, we're going to write our names, and that was it. There wasn't much more instruction. And the kids kind of all just started doing it, and then he walked around, and I think he kind of was like, if the kid would raise their hand, or he was responding to the children who wanted help and responding to their questions, but it was so hands off, right? But it wasn't free range. It wasn't like, oh, you're doing whatever you're doing, we're doing this project, we're going to write our names in this, so it was very directed. But then it was this idea, what I say in the book, it's this idea of minimal interference, right? So one of the anthropologists, that Suzanne Gaskins, who I cite in the book so much, she says she thinks of the Mayan mom or the Mayan dad kind of sitting in the background, kind of standing in the background, watching carefully and ready to respond to the child and ready to help. But they're letting the child take a shot at it, right? They're letting the child do what they can do on their own, because they see that as, like you say, like the maximal way of growing, right? If you go in there and guide the child and tell them specifically what to do at every moment, then you've limited the child's path. And I think you've also, a lot of parents around the world will think you've limited their growth, right? I looked up this one quote about in this hunter-gatherer group in the Kalahari Desert, which so they have a word for learning and teaching are the same, and I can't say it has like a click in it, but parents will often use the phrase, she's teaching, learning herself, while child is trying to figure something out. So there's this idea that, like, the parent is encouraging the child to focus on something, right? Okay, focus on digging tubers, focus on butchering a seal, right? There's like a guidance, there's encouragement, but then they let the child see what the child can do and watch the child and then respond, right? So I think that there's something in between, like total free and this authoritarian approach, which I think is really powerful, right? Because then the child has its own path and kind of grows in how it knows it can grow, but it also has this support and, like you say, this connection, because that's the second component of intrinsic motivation, right? It's autonomy and then connectedness, right? There's all this data that shows that when the child is connected to the teacher, like how much better the kids do, and it's this. I mean, it's the same for parenting, right? But I would argue it's the same for the classmates, right? If they feel this like connection to the classmates and to the, you're much more likely to work harder. You're much more likely to be, you're much more likely to stay focused and more attentive. There's a lot of evidence on that. And it reminds me, when I was writing this piece on attention, I read about this little boy. I think he had ADHD, and he was having a hard time in the classroom. And the teacher started giving him responsibilities in the classroom. Like, you're helping me on these days. You're, passing these things out. He became like a teacher's helper, and like having that connection to his teacher, like boosted his ability to pay attention and his motivation. And it really struck me, because that's all of what this parenting and Hunt-Gather Parent is about, is building a connection to your parents, to your teachers, to the adults in your life. And then kids want to work for you. They want to work with you, right? Instead of it being this thing where, like you say, you're like pulling them along. So some of the connectedness in a classroom might be analogous to sort of the building relationships, but it's also, we talk a lot about authenticity. So connectedness to the work that they're doing. One of the things that we mention is, or I ask, why. When I go and observe students working, I ask them, first of all, what they're doing, and I say, why are you doing it? And what we hope they're not going to say, what we're trying to shift teaching and learning and the work that teachers are doing is away from the answers that would be, because the teacher told me to, or it's going to be on the test, or it's going to be for points or grades, or the always heralded, I'm going to need this in the future, which for them is like Friday, right? So, it doesn't really resonate. So what we want to do, get them to say, like, this is a really relevant, meaningful piece of work, and I'm doing this because in project-based learning, for example, that's a driving question. We're trying to answer that driving question, or this need to know question, but that it is meaningful and it is authentic work. And most
most organic places, that can be really powerful. In addition to the relationships of teachers, there are certain examples I've seen where, and I can recall some where I didn't have good relationships with teachers, but I learned a lot. So it's not, doesn't mean that you have to, but there are some real sparks there. And the other piece that you're mentioning is sort of in teaching, we would call it the zone of proximal development. And so it's like like productive struggle, right? And one of the things that they say, like the guide on the side as opposed to sage on a stage, which is a bit too binary, but it is like a really great teacher facilitator, just like a parent, I think, is that person who has that ability to be perceptual or have the perception of what the student is doing, thinking, and when you need to step in with a little bit more support or a question that pushes them or an exercise or activity or something to help support them because they can't go any further without that. But as much as possible, you want to give them that leash to try and fail and then figure it out for themselves. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think now you've tapped into the third component, which is competency, right? Like that if you feel too much like you're failing, it's too hard, you will give up, right? You will be not motivated to come back. And so we often think of that as praise, right? That you praise the child. And in Hunt Gather Bear, I talk about all these other ways actually that are probably more powerful than praise. One of the things that's been really powerful with my daughter and really changed our relationship is this acceptance of her contributions, right? So like we tend as parents and teachers to think that the kids can't really contribute or something. It's very like they're not the equal citizens in our households, you know, like that they
infantilize them.
Yes, and that they aren't competent, right? Like one of the psychologists kept saying they're not competent. Like you're in the kitchen and you working with your child, and it's like you don't think the child can actually help make dinner, right? Like you're just having them there to teach them or keep them busy, but they're not actually going to help you in the kitchen. And that mentality is incredibly demotivating for a child, anybody, right? I mean, and so this idea of competency, actually, if you do think that they can help, you do think they contribute, that when they chop up vegetables and they learn, you still use them, or you're like, you listen to their ideas. And I mean, that just listening to my 4-year-old's ideas and just really listening, not pretending to, and not being like, oh yeah, that idea, listening to it and really thinking about it and then building off of that and accepting her idea and accepting her contribution turns the relationship into went from a hierarchy, right? From me being the authority and the information flowing to her to a collaboration. That's really where you start to, and then the child feels like, wow, they're like really contributing to this task, to this family, and the motivation, like for me, my daughter's motivation skyrockets when that happens, because she's a full-fledged member and she feels competent. So to me, it's like way more important to accept her ideas, at least acknowledge them.
Right.
Maybe not do them, but like build off of them, or then to praise her. And I think there's so many more powerful tools out there to help kids feel competent than verbal,
Right. So I'm imagining some of the sort of pushback or to play devil's advocate. So the praise piece and, so a more traditional parenting approach, what do they, spare the rod, spoil the child kind of thing, and an over permissiveness and, this sort of mindset that children are every bit as good as adults at everything. And I don't think that's what you're saying, but I can imagine that pushback, right? And, so
right, sure.
What are the lessons that you've learned that, what would the people that you talked to and wrote about, what would they say to that of this permissiveness, or like who's in charge, right? I mean, it kind of comes down to a bit of hierarchy. As we were talking before we went live, to use the example of my daughter the other day, my 12-year-old, I said, let's go, we're going someplace, you and your sister, we need to go to do something, and I need both of you. And she said no. And I was like, well, that's not really an option here, right? So how would they, respond or think about that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's not just do whatever the child says by any stretch of the imagination at all. And it is, again, it's somewhere between. It's somewhere between, and the parent is absolutely in charge. I mean, in fact, the children that the families I was with, the children were way more respectful, way less walking over their parents than I see in San Francisco. I mean, literally, after we went to the Arctic and I landed in Calgary, I was just like, whoa, the most like disrespectful children. Like, I mean, the difference is huge. So I think it's because the parent is still encouraging the right behavior and still pointing out the improper behavior, right? They're still saying, well, that's disrespectful. That's not helpful. That's not what we do. Or one of the big things is connecting it to maturity. Oh, that's like a baby. That's, because you're a baby. I mean, there is some tough stuff, right? I mean, that's tough for a kid to hear, at some level, but it's just not getting angry, and it's not forcing it, and it's not punishing, and it's not yelling. It's just pointing it out, like matter of factly, that like, oh, if you treat me that way, then you're a baby, or, when my daughter would hit me when she was a toddler, I would come at her with like sternness and put, oh, she set boundaries, and it just made it worse. But when I told her like, ow, that hurts me. Do you not like me? She was like, it took a couple weeks, a couple hits of me being like, oh, that you don't like me. So, and then she finally said one day, and I actually have it on tape, and it ran in NPR. It's incredible. She says, no, I love you, Mama. Like she just was not connecting this idea that her hitting me had this like negative, right? So it's a much gentler approach to teaching and guiding. But absolutely the boundaries are there and they're clear. They're just not angry and emotional and like in this very like what we is like disciplining, right? They also use stories, they use like these plays, they use questions. So a big thing is like questions are everywhere where we went. Like, if the kid, is like when Rosie, the kid was like jumping on one of the parents and like on their back, and it's like, what am I, like trying to ride on the back of the parent? It's like, who am I, your donkey? Like, it's this, it's getting the child to think and also teaching the child the consequences of their actions versus just telling the child what to do. Right.
Yeah. There's a low ceiling to that latter approach that, sort of, again, like putting the locks on the cabinets, and if maybe that's an absurd example, but at some point the child has to understand. I mean, they'd be able to. I say extreme or absurd because at some point they would be able to reason that you don't open doors with or take poison, and they can logically figure that out. But just the sort of idea, the principle of like, I'm not even going to let you think through this. I'm not even giving you the opportunity. So like I've just recently pushed the laundry duties for my daughters of their own, not mine. I said, look, I'm going to do my laundry from now on, and I expect you to do yours. And I will remind you from time to time, I see the hamper's full and you might want to do that, because here's what's going to happen. Today's Monday, you're going to not have clothes for school. And interestingly enough, yesterday we went to lunch and ran some errands. My oldest, she had started the laundry, but of course it was in process, and she said, I don't have any clothes to wear. I said, well, there you go, right?
Exactly. Like life teaches you. Maria Lugutan told me that. She's like, life teaches you, right? And like, but that you're using one of the tools in the book, this consequence tool, right? Where you tell the child the consequences of their action instead of telling the child what to do. Right. And they will do this even with very little children. So like one of the things I noticed when we were in the Arctic was that the parents never told Rosie, don't. Like I was constantly, don't do this, don't do that. Don't, don't suck your thumb, don't throw the stick, don't, and I was like, they never say don't. They tell the child the consequences of their action, and I think it's like they think more of the children in some way. They expect the child to think about it and figure out so there's autonomy, right? That's a beautiful example of autonomy, right? But cooperative autonomy, right? It's not just free range, independent, do whatever. It's I'm allowing you to make that decision. You're choosing. So like one time Rosie had these rocks at the playground when we were in the Arctic, and she was like juggling them, like throwing them in the air, and I wanted to say, don't throw the rocks, right? And this little 9-year-old comes over and says, Rosie, you're going to hurt somebody with those rocks. And then she walked away. And and what did Rosie do? I saw her, she kind of stood there and was like, and then she dropped them, so So that's like she was making the decision herself.
Right.
But she was also, that 9-year-old was teaching Rosie to be kind to the other people, right? So there was still boundaries being set, right?
Yeah. Did you notice any examples of, because, and I asked this question maybe selfishly because I, with my father, certainly had lots of angry back and forth yelling. It was sort of, this is how we navigate. And, some of that is just, traditional, how we go back and forth and personalities and stuff like that. And there's certainly
that's how I was with my father too.
Right. And so as I'm trying to think through this with my youngest, my oldest is much easier to get along. She doesn't sort of push the buttons, similar to my older brother and myself. I would push the buttons. I had to learn what hills were worth dying on and which ones you go, okay, I'm gonna, I'm just gonna seed the ground here, right? And so with my youngest, who is more like me and has a bit more fiery, when she was younger, she would hit, I had to hold her tight as she threw fits and, that kind of thing. So there was, I remember one moment I was had to do with long hair and brushing and tangles and showers, and it was I got so frustrated I sort of threw a brush down and it actually bounced and then hit her foot, and I was like, oh wow, that's a moment that I had a conversation with her. I said, I have to do a better job of not escalating. You also have a responsibility here to not escalate and to do some of these things, but the fact still remains that sometimes when kids push the buttons and push the boundaries, as they should, and that's part of the learning process, that emotions, as much as we value their emotions, whether they're sadness or uncomfortable or whatever, the anger is also a valid emotion. And so I often tell my daughters, manage your emotions or your emotions will manage you. So I try really hard to not escalate and move up there. But there are times, just like the other day, I did raise my voice and I was very stern with her, and probably would, the folks in your book would go, oh, you've pushed out of the box here, right? So I'm wondering if you saw that kind of response from them.
So there's two things I'll say. One of the huge differences I saw, and which really shifted what I thought was possible as a parent, is that parents don't argue with children, like, ever.
Right.
I never saw it. Like, there's just no arguing that goes on. There could be some guiding and some kind of, like, with the my moms, I often saw, like, they'll say things 3 times, like, and then that's it. Like, it's really like, and all 3 things will be said in kind of the same tone, like 1, and then they'll wait 5 or 10 minutes, 2, and like, they just don't argue. And like this, if an argument starts to brew, if like there's negotiation starting, it's just done. Like, there's done. This idea that parents argue with children, I think, is pretty unique to us and into Western culture in some ways. And I started doing that with Rosie. It's like, I'm American, I'm highly verbal. So I will say, I'm not going to argue with you. And I will walk away. Yeah. Or I will like tap her on the shoulder and walk away. But I just saw none of it. Like, none of it. When we were in the Arctic, we spent 2 weeks with this family, and I realized towards the end I had never heard an argument between anyone. Like, and it was kind of crazy to me. It was So I don't think that arguing is required for a parent-child relationship, although we think it is. But and I have to say that once I stopped arguing with Rosie, I'm not saying I never do, but once I really made a concerted effort to just basically walk away. Right. Like, I literally walk away, and it's such a powerful thing to her, right? To have her parent walk away from a child, right? She knows. It is not permissive. Let's put it that way. Right. In many ways, it's sterner than arguing with her, right? Because it's like, you don't even earn my attention. But number 2, not all parents view young children and children as pushing buttons. And this is something I talk about in How Gather Parents. It's really key. This idea that I often view, Rosie as pushing my buttons, pushing boundaries, manipulating me. Like, there's this very kind of, I don't know where it comes from. I mean, it's common, right? In our culture. And I asked Inuit parents this and elders, and they were just, one woman even laughed at me. She's like, 3-year-old can't push her buttons, she's not manipulating you. So many cultures see children as like irrational, illogical beings that haven't matured enough, and that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know the consequences, like the hitting, right? Like she doesn't know that that's hurting me. And it's the job of the parent to teach them this, to teach them the consequences of their behavior, the consequences of what they're doing. And so there's no reason to argue with it like a irrational, illogical being, right? It's you're never going to win, right? They're not. So I think once I started viewing Rosie's behavior that way, a lot of the anger went away, because it was like, oh, she's just this little creature that like doesn't understand.
Right.
And it's my job to help her understand, and getting angry at her is not going to help her understand. Like the parents told me, getting angry at her is just going to learn her to teach her to be angry and teach her to argue. And, a lot of the parents told me, and I looked up this with psychological research, when you yell and argue with children, they stop listening to you. And the parents told me this. They were like, if you yell at her and you argue with her, she's just going to stop listening to you. And, but I think really it was this shift in my perspective of her motivations and the reasons behind her behavior. Because once I was changing how I thought of her and what she was doing, my response to her changed, right? She could feel, right, that instead of trying to help her, and so it was kind of went from a conflictual, very adversarial interaction to something that was much more gentle and nurturing, right? And so it's crazy to say, once I stopped getting angry and upset when she hit me and just kind of being like, oh, that hurts, and like she stopped hitting me. I mean, very, very quickly. And actually her tantrums went away too. So this is kind of more parenting than teaching, but I think we assume kids' motivations are something, and I don't think that there's data or science to back that up, and a lot of that is a cultural construction.
Yeah, I think it's intuitively true to me, and I think about, I very rarely argue with my daughters, and there are very rarely things that we have much conflict over.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, well,
it's wonderful.
But I do think there's a bit of a different way that I think about kids and people than others, which may or may not be better. I mean, it's certainly different. I think it's better because, that's why I hold that belief. But I do think that they have, I view them not as a pain in the butt or a burden or, that they have any bad intentions. I mean, that would seem bizarre to me. I do understand that they are beings that are in developmental stages. I mean, we're all in developmental stages, but theirs is their stages are happening much more quickly in their short term.
Right,
and so
right.
Understanding that is really important. On the other side, there are times, we talk about, again, constructivist learning, and I sort of joke about this in a way a colleague years ago shared with me, talk about constructivist learning, and there's an assumption, or there's a sort of an underlying assumption that you have the time, so I'm not going to argue with you, I'm going to walk away, and this is going to resolve itself through a few other mechanisms that will come to play, and you'll learn. But that assumes that you have sort of almost an infinite amount of time, right? And so, the joke or the line was, if you're in a crowded theater and there's a fire, you don't start asking the people next to you questions to help them make meaning of where the exit is.
To make them think of it, yes.
Yes, right?
Yes.
And so,
absolutely.
Right. The other day, my conflict with my youngest was, and that came to a point because there was an urgency and we needed to get there and back. So I didn't have time to just go, and this does play out in the classroom as well. It's like we have some deadlines and some urgency here, and that does create some different. I wonder if culturally some of those pieces are not as prevalent in some of those civilizations or cultures that you visited.
I mean, I definitely think that there are moments when all of these go out the window and you just help the child, or you like force the child. I mean, there's definitely times when the parent forces the child to do something, I think it's much rarer. And I think that it's a lot of thought is, a lot of thought is given to try not to do that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
The default is not that. And
Right.
I think a lot of what I see and what I was taught as a parent is the kind of default is that, you know, and then I didn't even know about kind of these other methods of like encouraging, letting the child figure things out. So no, definitely there are always exceptions to these rules. But I think they definitely are less busy in a lot of ways. And I do think it's harder when we're pressed for time.
Yeah.
But that said, I think that we have a lot more time than we think we have. And, you know, and I think that once we start kind of recognizing that, oh, if I just take a minute to kind of, or 30 seconds to extinguish what's the past struggle that's happening, I'm going to save myself time in the long run anyway, you know, like this methods have saved me time because I'm not in this big emotional burst and we're not in this big argument and tears and
right.
But no, your point is perfectly well taken. There are times when the parent just fixes the problems. And
well, I mean,
but I'll give you another example of. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, just in full transparency, I told my daughter, I said, if I need to grab you and take you downstairs and put you in the truck, I will do that. And I was like, whoa, you know, because we have to go. Like,
you know, but I think kids are more, and one of the anthropologists told me this, that what she sees with my communities, I think the kids are more open to these moments where they are forced to do things because they so often aren't.
Yeah. Hopefully. And,
right?
and I think maybe that might be in the long term, but maybe not in the short moment. In that moment, at least with my daughter, she's like, that's not happening anytime soon, or I'm going to fight you in that. But, you know, in reflection, I think she would agree with you. She would say, yeah, there on the whole here, this is how things go. And I really sort of crossed the line here and didn't, you know, I was openly defiant. And yeah, so I don't know, you were going to mention an example.
Right. I mean, I was going to mention an example with pushing the line, like when would a parent step in? Mm-hmm. And it was we were on a cenote. It's like these underground swimming holes in the Yucatan, mm-hmm. And it was if Rosie had fallen in, she had on the life jacket for a long time, and then she took it off, and we were like sitting there at the edge just waiting. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, if she had fallen in, it would be catastrophic, right? And I was sitting there with her. It was a potentially dangerous moment, right? Mm-hmm. And I was holding her hand, and then we got up to leave, and I turned my back on her for like literally 3 seconds. I am not kidding you. Like I let go of her hand and turned to leave. And there was my mom, grandma, that I didn't even know was there behind me in the shadow. And she was watching the entire time. And she came in and grabbed Rosie's hand when I let go of it. And she said to me in Spanish that, that this is very dangerous and I need to be very careful. Like, I am not kidding you, right? So this is not like free range. This woman was, and I realized that she'd been following us. She was like the mom of one of the teenagers that was with us. And she had been following us. And I didn't really understand why she was following us, and she was hanging around. And then I realized exactly what she was doing. She was protecting us. She knew that I was a visitor and I didn't know what was going on. And it was incredible. It was an incredible moment. And it made me realize this idea, this cooperative autonomy idea, where everyone's allowed to make their own decisions, but we're going to take care of each other at the same time.
I like that cooperative autonomy. I may co-opt that. One other thing that I think
it's not me. It's not me. There's an anthropologist that came up with it. I can give you his name, but it is very interesting, right? Because in hunter-gatherer communities, they value generally they value autonomy. They value that, but they are also raise incredibly cooperative human beings. So how do you do that, right? How do you value somebody's right to make a decision, but also train them to be helpful and kind and cooperative? And
right.
Yeah.
Well, the autonomy, connectedness, and competency reminds me of Daniel Pink's work, which is around autonomy, mastery, and purpose, as you try to, motivate people to do things in the workplace, or I think in the classroom. Yeah. And I think there's some crosswalks here on those pieces, but we've referenced free range several times, and every time we've referenced it, I thought, well, I think it's an important thread to pull out here, the sort of role of psychologists and psychology and some of the science here that you mentioned. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's work, The Coddling of the American Mind, if you've read that and familiar with that.
I haven't read that.
Yeah, it's really, really good. And I think Jonathan or Greg have both been on NPR and made the rounds, but social psychologist and at NYU, I think. Anyways, they have lots of pieces. They actually have a website. Jonathan's been on the podcast, but letgrow.com and coddling. And so, and I'll reference those in the show notes. But one of the things that they talk about is that we are coddling our kids too much, and that we should give them more sort of free range experiences, which is not to say that they don't have any boundaries or any authority or anything like that. And as a matter of fact, that the boundaries, I don't know that they talk about this much, but my psychology background would say, without those boundaries and those firm walls, and kids knowing that those firm walls are going to be there, they feel a sense of insecurity because they don't know where the walls are. And so it sort of feels like you're free falling. Whereas if they know that mom and dad or whoever those people are, they're there, they will let me go as far as I can within reason and within safety, and correct me or grab me from falling in the water in the Yucatan or whatever. And so, the idea that free range is bad is not what we're saying, that there is a huge value, and it's consistent with your book and what you're talking about.
Huge value.
Giving them the opportunity to navigate the various relationships and struggles and conflicts and problems and learn from that.
It's interesting because what I saw and what I talk a lot about in Hung Other Parent is that the parent is slowly training the child for these skills. So it's not just like, oh, now you go to the grocery store, actually Maria in Yucatan, she told me that I think her 3-year-old wanted to go to the little market. I mean, it's a very small town, the market's like 2 blocks away. I mean, and she really wanted to go. And instead of just letting her go, she had the older child, the 12, at that time, I think 10 or 11, follow behind her, just like the mom did to me, and watch her kind of, but from a distance. So she thought she was going on her own, right? And so then she, over time, the older daughter would go farther and farther back, or only go halfway, all right? So I think we think of things again as oh, you do that, now you're ready to do it, and you do it, right? Whereas I think many cultures, learning is this very slow process, just like we do with reading and math, right? It's a step-by-step process, and the parent's job is to provide these little slow steps, right, to build up, so that now that 5-year-old market all the time by herself, and it's very safe because she's done it many times, and she's been trained, right, to watch the traffic, and she knows the person behind the counter. And so yes, it is this sense of, and what this does is allow the child, just like you're saying, this autonomy, which is incredible for our mental health, required for our mental health, allows the child to grow, but within this safety, right? So that the child never feels like they're, like you say, going beyond their own skill level, right? There's always somebody there, or they've learned over time. So with my daughter, that's what I'm trying to do, right? Is if she shows interest in something, I'm not just no, you can't do that, you're not ready. Well, let's find a way that you can do a piece of it, right? Or let's find a way that you can do it so that you are safe, and when you practice it. In the book, I talk a lot about everything is about practice, right? So for instance, she was in with me because I traveled with her with interviews, and at first she was horrible. She couldn't stay quiet during interviews, and then I realized, oh, I need to train her. Let's start with 5 minutes. Be quiet for 5 minutes, and then go run out and play. Or now we'll build up to 10 or 15, and now she can sit in an hour interview with me, right? Yeah. And so instead of right away being oh, you're too young, you can't go to interviews, it's no, just do a little piece of it, and then grow over time. Which that way I feel it's okay, she can have what we think of as free range in some ways, but it's also very safe, and it doesn't feel we're not sacrificing any of that, right?
Right. Yeah, I actually it's funny. My daughters and I ran some errands yesterday and went and picked up something at a home goods store. And my oldest had said, "Oh, this is the place where I got to pick out the front door mat." And of course, she doesn't. I don't think she understands quite why I laughed and thought this would be a great front door mat, but it says "Caution, free-range children" inside. So there you go.
That's funny.
But looking through some of the suggestions in your book, talking about the neighborhood autonomy zone.
Right, autonomy zones. Right.
It is so important for these kids to have relationships, not just with people they like, but that they dislike, and to they were playing tag the other night, running around the house and outside and inside, and it was a wild scene. And so my oldest was complaining. She said, the other neighborhood daughter, she every time I got to her, she said, "I'm on pause." So there's that conflict of negotiating the rules. It's like, right. Good, and
right.
I need,
right.
The other parents say, "Oh, I'm sorry
right.
if my
Practice,
daughter
right?
Right. I'm sorry if my daughter was mean to your daughter." I was like, "No, they need to be, right?
They need to be."
Not that I want them to be mean, but you get the point, right?
Yeah, it's so funny because in the Arctic, the number one thing the parents told me was don't yell at your children, don't argue and don't yell. But the number two thing they always told me was don't get involved in their arguments.
Right.
like just let unless their safety is concerned,
right,
they would say,
right.
Unless someone's really going to get hurt. But it's like that's their practicing. That's the way they're practicing to be adults and handle it. Like if you're, and they kept telling me that, and Rosie was only 2 at the time, and I didn't really understand it, or 3.
Right.
I didn't really understand it, but now that she's 5, I understand it. There's so much of that, right? And
so here's a follow-on question though. Do they? Because full transparency, I think it's important for children to see adults, and I'm going to use the word argue, but productively disagree is probably a better way, right?
Or debate,
right. That they are able to see how two people, even on really passionate emotional issues, are able to navigate those in ways that are successful, even if they end up disagreeing. That I think that we do a disservice if we hide that from them.
Oh, absolutely. So just to make it clear, like in Western culture, we separate the adult world and the child world.
Right. It's weird.
Very, very, we rip it apart. In many cultures and throughout human history, the two worlds are combined, right? Very little is hidden from a child, and they're welcomed into most everything unless they're going to really mess it up, like seal hunting at the beginning. But even then, one of the grandpas told me that we would, if the kid really wants to go, I'll take him with us, but we'll get an older child to come and we'll stay farther back because they're too loud, basically, little kids. And then over time, as the child learns to be quieter, we'll move them closer and closer. That's another amazing example. So yes, no hiding goes on. Very little hiding goes on. We tend to, which again disconnects us from the children and demotivates them in many ways. I think.
Yeah, and it disconnects them from the reality that they're going to face when they become adults in some ways.
Exactly. Like, how do we expect them to learn the skills of the adult world if they're never in it?
Right. One last thing that I wanted to ask before I give you a chance to sort of share any links and places that people should find you. So it sort of relates to the sort of hierarchy or control, but there's in permissiveness. And I think there's some sort of middle ground between sort of the free range and sort of the more authoritarian. For sure there is, but then I wonder how much you saw or lack of seeing this sort of approach of parenting of sort of bargaining with a child, right? So I want them to do this, so I know they're not going to like it, or if they push back and say, I don't want to do that, then bargaining with them and saying, if you do this, we'll, if I would have said to my daughter, okay, so we need to go, and I know you don't want to go, but we'll go and we'll get ice cream.
Right, like a bribe.
Right.
Yeah. So I do think that many cultures do little bribes with kids, and I did see a little bit of it. I think the bribe though is way less than you think. So for instance, there's evidence that the Maya or the indigenous Mexican family will give the kid this is in a research study a pencil sharpener. Right? So yeah. So I think we give away enormous quantities of things, right? So I've turned like, little tiny things can be a bribe for a kid, right? It doesn't have to be something big. We give away way too much, right? And then the bar just goes higher and higher, right? If we're starting at a pencil sharpener, like, right? I mean, but I also think that the bribes are often in the rewards. Rewards are very rare. And these are very rare. I don't want to give the impression that these are very common. They're very rare. But it also happens like at the end of the week, or for the whole family gets it, or it's for like, an entire week's worth of behavior. Like, oh, you're really starting to be more helpful around the house. You're really starting to learn to be helpful. You can get this thing at the store, that versus like this very one-to-one, you do this and then I'm going to give you this. Right. So it is there, but it's like I say, I think we've taken it to this like incredible level. You're going to get like a Lego kit,
right.
Like it's just like we give away way too much. In fact, like I will even use things like she'll want me to come and like, I'm just going to sound terrible, but she'll want me to come and like do something with her. And I'll be like, well, first clean this up. It's like,
right.
First we got to clean the dishes before we go hang out and play on the living room floor, and so I think there is that like sense of like,
I would default to something like that, but my default is not to use bribes. If you do this, even though you don't want to, we'll do that. I try not to do that because in principle, there's such a slippery slope there, and it seems like a terrible sort of rule to expect that I can manipulate you. I'll say no to this because if I say no and then you're likely to say, well, let me go get, I don't know if your daughter's too young, but Squishmallows is what my daughter's, that's their thing right now. He'll let me get some Squishmallows or something like that. And you also mentioned praise, and one of the things that also is a part of that, and I think an important piece here, and maybe you could speak on this briefly, is the idea of criticism and sort of calling people out. Like, so let's be real honest here. Yeah. Not only are we expecting you to engage in ways that are age appropriate, but as part of the community of things, but when you fail, like I told my daughter the other day, because she eventually came, but she was going super slow, and she was just slow playing it, dragging her feet, and it was if we were going to get Squishmallows, she'd have been in the truck, boom, right? And I said, you're acting like a selfish jerk. And because essentially right now you're hurting your sister because she wants to get there and get back. And I do think as an addendum is like, so I didn't say you are a selfish jerk. You're acting like, so this is the behavior, like you said, you're acting like a baby. Acting like a baby. Whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. So if you look at what's happened to American parenting, like in the last few decades, basically we've like erased criticism, like we just erased the bad things that kids have done. I mean, not all parents, right? But this is the trend that like you only praise and you kind of ignore the bad parts. Right. And this is crazy. If you look around the world, this is like absolutely you tell the child like that was unhelpful, right? Like, but again, it's not this like, oh, you're so helpful, you're a jerk, like you're saying, like it's just a fact. Like that, what you did right there was unhelpful. Right. Or sometimes some of the parents will be very sarcastic and be like, they'll tell them the opposite, like, oh, or they'll like kind of make a joke out of it, like, oh, you're so late. Oh, you just be lazy. You just sit there and be lazy, right? So it's like this joke, right? But it's clear, right? But absolutely, and you pointed out in other people, like, oh, they didn't help. That was unhelpful. Did you see that? Because the child is learning the value system through what you say and don't say. And part of that is what you don't do, right? So absolutely. I think you've got to point these things out to kids.
That's interesting.
I think it does them a disservice not to.
Right. I would agree. It's interesting you mentioned sarcasm because that is something that I've seen, on Twitter, which of course is real life, is that you say, there are lots of teachers and lots of educators, and I was told, I sort of make the joke, but like that you should not use sarcasm. And I always say, in education they told us never to be sarcastic, so I'm not, which of course is sarcastic, right? But like, I mean, I will say to the daughters, my girls, I say, will you do your dishes? And they will do all of the dishes except for anything that they touched. And I said, you can touch those too, right? Like, It's okay to put that second plate in here, not just yours.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of parents, yes, they're definitely pointing out, you need to. Otherwise, what I think happens is the kids can't handle criticism.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. I mean,
that's the coddling.
And yeah, yes. And I think there's good evidence that from this, that in like the Mayan cultures, the kids don't view the criticism as bad. They view it as guidance, right? That the parent is trying to help them learn. Right. That it's not, and that's why like what you're talking about, like you're unhelpful versus that's unhelpful, right? Because I don't think it's conveyed in this very like accusatory, kind of personal, angry tone. It's just that's unhelpful, right? And actually, the more I become like kind of less emotional about these criticisms and guidances on both ends, like good and bad, the more I see that Rosie is able to take them in, right, as like what they are, as just guidance in teaching versus some some personal attack on her or some evaluation of her as a person, right? So definitely, I think we need to. I think it's not only that we need to maybe go back to criticizing. I think we need to relearn how to criticize in a way that's not an impersonal attack. That doesn't create conflict. Right. That just kind of gets the job done in the sense of teaching the child versus attack. I think that's what I've been learning a lot is like, okay, and even Rosie one day I said, Rosie, I've had a really hard time getting you to help clean up the living room. And parents will say this, like, just, like, what's going on? Like, they'll ask the kid, like, we're having this conflict around this. Like, what's going on? And she said, we don't really ask very nicely. And I was like, you know what? You're right. Like, I don't. I ask nicely for a lot of things, like helping in the kitchen and helping in the garden or the dog. But with the living room, I don't ask very nice. She's exactly right. And so I was like, I've been trying to add, I think that we generate a lot of conflict where we don't need to generate conflict, is what I'm trying to say. Right. So.
Well, there's
criticism doesn't have to make a fight, right? Like,
right.
I think it's like it doesn't have to make the kid feel bad.
So that's and it relates, I think, to the Coddling in the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt and Lukianov's work that mentions it. They talk about sort of the safe spaces and trigger warnings and stuff. And we don't need to pull that string at this point, but it does. We talk about it in classrooms as kind, specific, and helpful feedback, and that is something that we've got to develop in our classrooms and in our schools and in our homes as well, is being able to have those hard conversations. And part of that is when it's interpersonal, it's criticizing or discussing or critiquing or whatever the behavior and actions, not the person, because your value as a person is degraded if you do that. And in the classroom, it's the work, the criticism is about the work, whether it's the teacher's work and teachers are criticizing one another, or we're evaluating, assessing student work. It's like, we need a rubric, we need a lens through which to evaluate that, and then that's we say this work is, here's the evidence of the work, but it's not a value judgment on the person, and that is helpful as well. So,
I mean, at the end of the day, it's about practicing, right? I think we've lost sight of that. We're so about like the goal and the grade and accomplishing the task that we forget that like it's just practice, right? The kids need practice, if of course you're going to need criticism, of course you're going to need feedback. They don't use the word criticism, and it's more feedback and guidance, right? And that's what I'm trying. That's the mindset I'm trying to give. Like, oh, you're unhelpful. That's like it's guidance, right? This is not being helpful. This is not what we need you to do,
right?
I'm not criticizing you. I'm guiding.
In the parental relationship, the connectedness is I think serves as sort of a rubric. This is the what we're after. This is the ideal. We're after this sort of helpfulness in service of the family. So and the last I'll say you mentioned too, and I don't want to go down the grades and points thing just in the interest of time, but you mentioned the space race as being maybe a catalyst. I've mentioned Nation at Risk, which is an education report probably 20 years after so the space race, but that drive towards accountability and tests and things like that I think probably has had at least some, if not pretty outsized effect on what we're seeing culturally, as we're not able to have some conversations and we're not able to disagree and have conflict in a way that is productive. I think that's probably, or at least a way out of it, is by getting our classrooms to have more, and our parenting to have more of this productive disagreement and that kind of thing. So, Michaeleen, I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for joining us. I want to give you an opportunity to share your links and anything where people can find it. The book is Hunt, Gather, Parent. So, where are all those things and places that they should find you?
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Foodie Science on Twitter, but you can also email me. I love getting emails and I will respond. I'm at M Doucleff, so my M and then my last name Doucleff at npr.org. And I'd love feedback and questions and what we should do more stories on. There's an interesting piece too on attention that I think that teachers might be interested in, that I did in 2018, looking at attention in Maya kids.
Interesting.
And it talks a lot about like motivation and how motivation and attention are connected. And there's a few neuroscientists that offered some really interesting insights about it. So
I'd be interested in taking a look at that as well. If you, where would they find that?
It's at NPR. If you look like NPR Doucleff attention, you'll find it.
Okay, and maybe I'll try to look that up, or if you want to send it to me,
I can send you the link.
Put it in our show notes. It doesn't show up on Apple iTunes because we can't put links there, but folks can always go to our website or other places. So, again, Michaeleen, it's been great talking. I think the book is really a useful piece, not just in parenting, but helping to sort of shift the mindset that I think I could argue that we are in dire need of. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.